Here is something that will quietly unsettle you. 60 million Americans paid money last year to find out who they are. They spit into tubes, uploaded documents, built family trees branch by branch. And almost every single one of them hit the same invisible ceiling. Not a dead end, not a missing relative. A wall, solid, uniform, and suspiciously consistent. The year 1870. Before that year, most American families simply stop. Names vanish, lines go blank. The tree doesn't thin out gradually the way you'd expect from older, less organized times. It cuts off, clean, like someone took scissors to it. And the explanation you'll find if you go looking, the one genealogy website handed you almost immediately, sounds perfectly reasonable. Birth certificates weren't common yet. The 1890 census was lost in a fire. Record keeping just wasn't what it is today. Neat answers, tidy, satisfying enough that most people nod and move on. I moved on too, for about a week. Then I started actually pulling on those threads. And what came apart wasn't a simple story of disorganization or historical bad luck. It was something much harder to explain away. A pattern of record loss so consistent, so targeted, and so conveniently timed that calling it coincidence requires more faith than most people realize they're being asked to have. Let's start with the fire, because that's where almost everyone starts. And it's a good place to start. Not because the fire explains everything, but because of what the fire doesn't explain. January 10th, 1921, a fire breaks out in the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. Inside that basement, the 1890 United States Census, the most detailed population count America had ever attempted. Nearly 63 million people documented, not just counted, but described. Immigration status, naturalization records, whether you owned your home or rented it, whether you'd served in the Civil War and which side you'd fought for, how many children you'd had, how many of those children were still alive. This wasn't a head count. This was a portrait of an entire nation at a very specific, very consequential moment in time. The generation that remembered what came before. The fire damaged it, badly. About a quarter was destroyed outright. Another half marked by smoke and water, but damage is not the same as gone. And here is where the story quietly shifts into something else. Those damaged records sat in government storage for 12 years. No restoration efforts, no emergency copying, and no archivists worked through the night to salvage what remained. Just boxes, sitting, deteriorating, for over a decade. Then, in December 1932, the chief clerk of the Census Bureau drafted a list, a destruction list, and sent it to the Librarian of Congress. On that list, the 1890 census. The Librarian of Congress reviewed it and identified exactly 0 records worth saving. Not a single page from 63 million names was deemed worth preserving. Congress formally authorized the destruction on February 21, 1933. One day later, February 22, 1933, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building, a fireproof facility, designed specifically to protect records exactly like the ones destroyed the day before. One day, of 63 million documented Americans, approximately 6,000 names survived. That's not a tragedy of circumstance. That's a ratio that requires explanation. But here's the thing about the 1890 census that most people miss entirely. It was the only census in American history stored without redundant backup copies. Every census from 1790 through 1880 had duplicates kept at state and local levels. If something happened in Washington, the states still had their records. For 1890, someone made a different decision. Everything went to one basement, one location, one fire, one authorization. One day before the building that would have saved it opened its doors. Maybe that's bureaucratic incompetence stretched to its most spectacular possible conclusion. Or maybe it's something you'll have to sit with. The census isn't the only piece. It's not even close to the only piece. Let's talk about courthouse fires, because there is a term that genealogists use so casually that most people don't stop to register how strange it is. They call them burned counties. Counties where courthouse fires wiped out vital records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, land deeds, probate documents, death records. The paper infrastructure of an entire community's existence gone. You might picture this as something that happened occasionally. A candle left burning too long, a faulty chimney, the ordinary hazards of the 1800s. Here are the numbers that make that picture collapse. 40% of Alabama counties lost their records to fire. 40% of Georgia counties. Nearly 40% of Mississippi. 60 of Tennessee's 95 counties experienced significant record loss. We are not talking about a handful of unlucky communities. We are talking about a regional pattern so consistent that researchers began using words like suspicious more than a century ago. And it wasn't always just once. Lenoir County, North Carolina, records destroyed in 1878, then again in 1880. Montgomery County, burned in 1835, then 1840, then 1886. Swain County lost everything in 1879. Then a mob burned the courthouse again in 1908, and nothing was saved. Port Tobacco, Maryland, an 1895 fire described by contemporary witnesses as suspicious destroyed the courthouse so completely that the town lost its status as county seat and essentially ceased to exist as a functioning community. These fires were not targeting grain stores or textile warehouses. They were hitting, with remarkable specificity, the exact buildings that held the documents connecting people to land, to family, to legal identity. One researcher described it as paper genocide, and when you look at what was specifically lost, that phrase stops feeling like an exaggeration. Native American land ownership records, documentation of mixed-race ancestry, property claims that contradicted official narratives about who owned what and who had rights to what. The paper record of an entire social structure that powerful people had very strong reasons to want erased. In several cases, witnesses reported seeing courthouse employees removing documents before fires began. Some of those documents ended up in private collections, locked, unavailable to the descendants who have spent decades trying to find them. But here is the layer underneath all of this that I think is the most important and the least discussed. Go back to 1870. Not to the fire, not to the courthouse records, to the people. That year, 4 million Americans appeared in federal records for the very first time. 4 million formerly enslaved people who had been documented in every previous census, not by name, but as inventory. The 1850 and 1860 censuses included something called slave schedules, separate documents that listed human beings as property, organized under the name of whoever claimed to own them. Age, gender, a number in a column. No names, no families, no identities, just a count of what someone possessed. Then came emancipation. Then came 1870. And suddenly, 4 million people needed surnames. Some took the names of the people who had enslaved them. Others chose names that carried meaning: Freeman, Justice, Liberty, Hope. Names that announced who they had become rather than what they had survived. But the choice itself created a genealogical problem that echoes forward into the present day. The same family might appear under different surnames in 1870 and 1880. A man might use one name for the census and a different name for church records. Children might carry their mother's chosen surname while their father used something else entirely. This wasn't carelessness. This was a survival strategy. Names were fluid because fluidity was necessary in a world that was still actively hostile. But that necessary fluidity made the paper trail nearly impossible to follow, and it placed a wall at exactly the same point in history where 4 million people's documented existence began. Not a gradual thinning, a hard start, a year zero. They weren't alone in this. If your ancestors arrived in America before 1820, there is almost certainly no manifest recording their arrival. The federal government didn't require passenger lists until the Steerage Act of 1819 took effect. Before that, immigration documentation depended entirely on individual colonial ports, most of which kept incomplete records or none at all. Roughly 80% of white immigrants who arrived before 1790 came from British territories and were never documented at the federal level. The National Archives states this plainly. They simply do not have arrival records for ships before 1820, with only a handful of exceptions. So let's lay it out together because the picture only becomes visible when you see all of it at once. Before 1870, enslaved Americans existed in federal records without names. Before 1820, most immigrants arrived with no documentation of their arrival. Before 1900, most Americans were born without birth certificates. The one census that captured the generation bridging all of this, the 1890 census, was the only census without backup copies, sustained fire damage, sat untouched for 12 years, and was then deliberately authorized for destruction one day before the fireproof building opened. And local records across 40% of southern counties burned in patterns that researchers have flagged as suspicious for over 100 years. every single category of document that would connect Americans to their pre-1870 history has been compromised, destroyed, or simply never existed. That is not a streak of bad luck. Streaks of bad luck don't have that kind of thematic consistency. They don't all point in the same direction toward the same year, cutting off the same populations. What you're left with after all of this is a question that's much harder to dismiss than the answers you were handed at the beginning. If the losses were random, you'd expect them to be random, scattered across time, across record types, across regions, without a discernible pattern. Instead, they cluster, they concentrate. They stopped, almost surgically, in 1870. And the records that did survive, those are worth looking at very carefully too. Here is a question that doesn't get asked nearly enough. If you wanted to find what survived, the records that made it through the fires, the deliberate destructions, the bureaucratic neglect, where would you go? The answer is not the Library of Congress. It's not a government archive. It's not a university research institution. It's a mountain in Utah, carved into solid granite 700 feet below the surface, climate-controlled and earthquake-resistant, designed to survive scenarios that most people only think about in the abstract. That is where the most comprehensive genealogical archive in human history lives. The Granite Mountain Records Vault, operated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Over 2 billion names preserved on microfilm. A nuclear-proof repository of human identity maintained not by any government, not by any public institution, but by a single religious organization. The obvious question is why? And the answer the Church will give you is straightforward. They believe in a doctrine called baptism for the dead. The idea is that living members can perform proxy baptisms on behalf of deceased ancestors, offering them posthumous membership in the faith. To do that, you need names. You need records. You need to know who existed and when and where. So the Church built the most sophisticated genealogical operation in the world, not as a public service, but as a theological one. The records exist primarily for a religious purpose you never agreed to participate in. This isn't speculation. In 1995, Jewish organizations reached an agreement with the Church after discovering that hundreds of thousands of Holocaust victims had been posthumously baptized without the knowledge or consent of their living relatives. Anne Frank's name appeared in temple records multiple times. The Church agreed to stop. Names kept appearing. The controversy didn't end. It just became less visible. In 2008, the Vatican instructed Catholic parishes worldwide to stop sharing records with Mormon genealogists entirely. That's not a small thing. That's the Catholic Church formally severing a records-sharing relationship because of concerns about what those records were being used for. The database kept growing. And then there's the company that most Americans actually use, the one with the television commercials and the DNA kits and the family tree software that feels intuitive and modern and completely secular. Ancestry.com. What most of its users don't know is that Ancestry was founded by graduates of Brigham Young University and built initially on digitized publications from the LDS Church. Its early infrastructure was deeply connected to the same religious archive system that fills the vault in Utah. The company has since been purchased by the Blackstone Group, a private equity firm, for $4.7 billion. Church members still receive free access. The LDS records still form a significant backbone of what the platform offers. Researchers at Harvard documented something that should give any Ancestry user pause. Members of the LDS Church can, from within the Ancestry interface, send relatives they discover directly to the Church for proxy baptism, with essentially a single click. You pay a monthly subscription to find your ancestors. Someone else uses what you find for religious rituals you didn't consent to and may not even know are happening. That's the infrastructure of surviving records. A private religious archive, a private equity-owned company built on that archive's foundation, and a user base of 60 million Americans who mostly have no idea how any of this connects. Now step back and look at the whole thing. You have a population that cannot trace its documented history before 1870. You have the one census that could have helped, deliberately destroyed one day before the building that would have saved it opened. You have local records burned across entire regions in patterns that researchers have called suspicious for over a century. You have 4 million people whose documented existence begins at a single arbitrary year with no paper trail behind it. You have 80% of pre-1790 immigrants arriving with no federal record of ever having come. And you have what's left, a nuclear-proof vault managed by a church, and a subscription platform built on that church's archives, now owned by one of the largest private equity firms in the world. This is not a conspiracy theory. A conspiracy theory requires secrecy and coordination that leaves no evidence. What's being described here is fully documented. The destruction authorization is a matter of public record. The founding history of Ancestry is publicly available. The Granite Mountain Vault is something the LDS Church openly discusses and invites visitors to learn about. The Vatican's decision to stop sharing records is not hidden. None of this is secret. It's just not the version of history that gets handed to you when you sign up for a DNA kit. The version you get handed is simpler. Records were incomplete back then. People moved around. Fires happen. History is messy. And history is messy? That part is true. But messy doesn't typically produce a wall this consistent at a date this specific, affecting this many populations in this many different ways simultaneously. What I keep coming back to, and I've been sitting with this for months, is something quieter than the institutional story. It's the other kind of record, the one that doesn't live in a vault or a database or a government basement, your grandmother's stories. The names she mentioned that don't show up in any searchable index, the places she described that sound nothing like what the textbooks say was there, the relationships she mapped out from memory that no document confirms, the things she said quietly and only once, as if she wasn't sure you were old enough to understand yet. Those are records too. They predate every census, every courthouse, every archive. They survived every fire because they weren't written down. They couldn't be authorized for destruction because no clerk knew they existed. They have been passed from person to person across generations specifically because the people carrying them understood, even without knowing the full institutional history, that the official version wasn't the whole story. The question worth asking right now, not tomorrow, not eventually, is whether anyone is still writing them down, whether the people who carry that knowledge are still alive, whether the generation that remembers is being asked before it's too late to ask. Because the official record ends at 1870, but the actual record never stopped. It just moved somewhere harder to burn, and it has been waiting for someone to take it seriously.